Hi Glen Peoples here, Monster Guitars. Right, as I promised, some interesting things are going to be happening with this guitar shape, which is definitely not a Mockingbird. I wouldn't do that. So I'll show you what those interesting things are. What you can see strewn about on my messy bench top is binding, as you may already have recognized. I'm going to put some binding on this guitar top, but I'm also going to have a slightly carved body, only very slightly. It means the binding isn't going to come up flush to the top here. It's going to be sitting down a bit further, and then I'm going to have to carve down to where the binding is sitting. I haven't decided exactly on my method yet. I've got a couple in mind, but they both include the binding being on the body. So let's first of all just route the binding channel, get the binding on, and then we can deal with the more complicated matter of carving. Now I'll swap the bearings again and go one deeper. I'll just show you something. So my router's okay, but it's not the greatest in the world. It's not the greatest bit in the world, it's not the sharpest there is. But it generally works. See, when I'm going along the grain, so the grain is going this way along the guitar, and when I'm cutting with the grain, it's nice and easy, there are no burn marks, but anytime there's a curve that makes me start to cut across the grain, so I'm basically cutting end grain, that's a lot more work, and you can see the burn marks there. And over here, in the curves where I'm doing nothing but crossing the grain, cutting cross grain, that's black. And then as I start to go with the grain, it eases up again. So you can really see the difference grain makes to the ease of a cut. Okay, let's swap the bearing. I'll do that again in another pass, going slightly deeper, and then we'll be ready to bind. That's a chamfer bit, or a bevel bit. And I can find a small piece of binding to conveniently demonstrate this. I probably can't. The height of the tip of that bolt that holds the bearing on and the bearing is about the height of a piece of binding. So what I shall do is have the bearing run along the inside of the binding channel so that the bolt goes no further than the bottom of the channel, and cut away a 45-degree bevel all the way around. That's the starting point. I might decide just to leave it like that, and that will be my carve, or I can then cut away onto that flat bevel and make it a bit more concave. That's a decision I can make later, but at least I'm going to be carving off that much. So this will be a way of, I guess, hogging away the initial chunk of material. Let's do this. I'm experimenting now. I hope I don't ruin things, but come on, live a little. Live a little, let's go. I have a visitor in my workshop. That's Nimmy, short for Nymphadora, one of our 3 cats. She comes and visits me sometimes. I like her visitors. All right, to work. It's not much of a carve. Very little has come off. It looks kind of cool. But what I can do now is put the binding on, and then if I decide I want to take more off using another method, well, I can do that. But that'll do for now. Short update. This is a new technique for me, so I'm tweaking it as I go. The original bevel wasn't deep enough. The binding channel is still way too tall for the binding, and I kind of am going with the view that I do want to just use this bevel rather than do any hand carving additionally. So I need to somehow make that bevel cut deeper. So what I decided to do is have the bearing not riding in the binding channel, but actually over the edge, just below the binding channel. And that, I'm finding, is enabling a much nicer looking, by which I mean much more visible and larger bevel. And now the binding channel, I've just checked, is just the right height for the strip of binding. That's perfect. So I think that's going to look quite good. Okay, so I'm going to go around and do a deeper binding channel now. A deeper bevel now. Then I might not bind right away. I'll think about what I have to do in regard to the neck pocket first. We'll see. I'm putting the binding strips in one layer at a time. So I went all the way around with white, and now I'm doing it with black. And it's kind of messy. I use more acetone than I should probably, but it's still pretty messy, especially when you're using black stuff. And it gets all over your fingers. I'm about to run out of acetone though. I'm going to put on a third layer of binding so that it goes cream, black, cream. But I will have to wait for the final layer because that's all the acetone I have left. What's in that capful? That's enough to finish off the black. Ugh. I've got most of the binding on, and there's just one final strip to go in, but that's a fairly tight curve, and I want to minimize the risk of that last piece snapping. Now the cream or ivory binding and the black binding, they're made basically of the same stuff, but they don't have all the same physical properties. And that black one snapped, a few previous versions of that black one snapped until I did this to make sure that it didn't. And what I'm going to do is take my heat gun and soften the piece of binding quite a bit and then press it in just to make it bend without breaking, quite simply. So just a low heat. You don't want to melt it. It's bent into a curve at the moment. When it gets really hot, it'll go limp and lie straight. Like so. Now, while it's still quite hot, very hot, I'm just going to press it in there. It'll cool down. I'll release it. It'll spring back slightly, but it will allow itself to be pressed back into this shape without breaking because it's been there once already. So I'll just hold this for a few minutes until it's cool, and then I will stick it in. Okay, that'll do. Now, I'm out of acetone, but I don't want to pause until some more acetone arrives. I've mentioned it in previous videos. Acetone is probably the best and easiest way of sticking in plastic binding, but this glue is quite good as well. It's universally recommended for plastic binding because it works. It's made by Weld On, and Weld On make a number of glues with different numbers. This is number 16. Fast set, clear, medium-bodied solvent cement. Working time 5 to 6 minutes. So it's a bit messy. And you want to put in enough so that there are no gaps. It does slightly melt the plastic, just not as extremely so as acetone. So it's basically held its shape, this piece of binding. Yep. So I put in a little bit more than I needed to there, but it's better to have too much than too little because it cleans off without too much trouble. You scrape it off. When you watch any guitar builder on YouTube, they show you, or at least I show you, what I think are the big, interesting steps. So much of the process you don't see, and it basically looks like this, or similar to it. I'm just going around the edges of the binding now, and the edges of the body with a razor, and scraping everything nice and flush. I would normally use 2 hands for this, but I'm holding the camera. These little jobs, just like sanding, oh gosh, especially sanding, take up an inordinate amount of time. Scraping the binding is going to take a bit of work. It's doable. I think I've still got a job here that can be redeemed into something nice, but it's going to take a bit of work. I've taped off a small part of the razor blade so that I don't cut too deep and start damaging the wood. I may put a few scratches on the wood, but I should be able to make that okay with some hand sanding. It's just a matter of getting everything nice and level. I can feel there are a few high spots where I'm just going to focus there first. That's coming down. The good thing about using this blade is that it doesn't take off very much on any one pass. So you can really focus on one area and hone it until you're happy with it. We're just about there. Okay, so as you can see, this is going to take a while. In order to sand where that bevel is, I'm inevitably going to be touching the top of the binding, which is okay. You can sand the top of binding and the sides, and then progressively get finer, which is what you will do with the wood anyway. I've got a folded toilet roll with some currently 240 grit sandpaper. I'm demonstrating on these long, straight-ish sides, which are nice and easy. Of course, it gets fiddly in the little curves, but I'll do my best. It's coming along all right. I'll continue to scrape and sand and clean up the binding generally. When the acetone arrives that I've ordered, because I ran out, I'm going to do a couple of tiny repairs somewhere. I forget where. I'll have to find it again. There's a slight separation between two of the layers of binding, and there's a little bit just at the corner there, which I can fix no trouble once the acetone arrives. The main point of this video was to look at the fact that I'm combining a bound body with a carved body. In this case, I ended up not really being that ambitious with the carve. It's just a simple bevel. I'll shape the edges on the back as well, and then we'll move on. To be continued.